Welcome back. Now we are looking at the textbook in Chapter 8. Chapter 8 aligns with beginning with Lesson 9 and Lesson 10 of our economic unit. And when we are moving through the textbook, we go from Chapter 4 to 6 and now up to 8. We'll come back to 7 when we study the Cold War, and we'll come back to Chapter 5 when we study economic and political authoritarianism, when we look at the USSR and when we look at the interesting combination of economic individualism and political authoritarianism called fascism with Nazi Germany. So how are we going to use Chapter 8? Well, we want you to leave Chapter 8 knowing more about Reaganomics and Thatcherism. We want you to know more about the backlash against Keynesian economics. We want you to understand that some people saw it as a movement towards or the road to serfdom, and there was a rejection of the culture of dependence that it created, and this new freedom through government that was Keynesian economics, that was the welfare state, was rejected by people that wanted to return back to economic liberalism and re-embrace the principles of Adam Smith. And they go by many names. Sometimes we call them neoconservatives. They're new to being conservative. So they had at one point been members of the Democratic Party in the United States of America, and then they decided, you know what, we have more in common with the Republicans. So being that they're new Republicans, they're newly conservative, they're often called politically neocons, new conservatives. And these neocons, they are often associated with the religious right, although not always. So they do see a purpose of having, for example, prayer in the classroom. They're often associated with traditions, as conservatives would be. And therefore, as society in America changes in the 50s to the 60s, that's a big jump. And from the 60s to the 70s, you see so much quick social change in America. Some people wanted to slow that change down, and they'd be called neocons. Another defining characteristic of a neocon is that they typically see the U.S. as having a bit of a global manifest destiny, in the sense that they're allowed to use their military and their foreign policy to get the tools and resources they need to have a comfortable American life. So if that means that they have wars of aggression to secure resources like oil, they believe it's acceptable. So neocons do believe in militarism by nature as well. So there is a basis on tradition, a basis on religion, a basis on use of militarism. There's this idea that neocons have that maybe government needs to, within the lives of Americans, needs to be quite minimal. They want freedom from government, right? Economically, but they also want political and social privacy from government. And neocons typically, wanting their rigid or rugged independence and individualism, they often are members of the NRA. And that's just some stereotypes that when you add enough together, you typically have defined most neocons. I prefer the term classical liberals, or just neoliberals, which sounds like a contradiction. How can you be a neocon and a neoliberal? Neocon, again, is more of a political term, that they are trying to slow the evolution of politics and the social values in America. Neocon is not meant to be an economic term. Neoliberal or neoclassical liberal is a more precise economic term, because what are we talking about? These are people that want to go back to Adam Smith. Adam Smith, classic economic liberalism. So how do we define Reagan when he wants to, reintroduce more elements of economic individualism? How do we distinguish Reagan from a president from the earlier 20th century, before the shift to modern economic liberalism? How do we define that he wants to go back? Well, he's new, neoclassic liberalism. So we have neoclassic libs and neocons that are the main emphasis of Chapter 8. Chapter 8 is going to be talking about challenges to liberalism in a contemporary sense, And these are two of the challenges they talk about. The chapter begins with looking at The Little Prince, which I think is an excellent, excellent critique of capitalism. The Little Prince from 1943 by a French author that I'm not going to try to pronounce. It's from a child's point of view about a prince who's on an asteroid, a businessman, sorry, on an asteroid, spending all his time counting the stars and claiming them so that he can use what he has now to buy more stars. And the idea is it's meant to show how irrational capitalism is, how irrational greed is, and how greed is not a means to an end, that it's not quenchable, right? You won't take care of the thirst of greed, and that's why it's meant to be sinful. We also have a reference to Fahrenheit 451 and a reference to The Giver. In The Giver, people give up all individual memories and strong emotions to create a more safe and peaceful society. So this is another example of a dystopia. Peace sounds like a utopian thing. Stability and safety sounds utopian. But to give up your memories and your emotions to achieve that, that's when it becomes dystopian. So what is a threat to liberalism? A threat to liberalism is when we sacrifice our individualism, right? We sacrifice our freedom because we think something like peace or stability or safety are more important. But it becomes dystopian in that trade-off. So nice little introduction. The textbook also on page 274 has an excellent, excellent summary of the difference between classic and modern liberalism. Classic liberalism, again, freedom from government, negative freedoms. Modern liberalism, freedom through government, positive freedoms. And the moment in America where they shifted from classic to modern liberalism, that's 1933. That's the election of FDR. That's the New Deal. A New Deal for America is that the government's going to inject themselves into the economic lives of the people. So what we're seeing here is an evolution of liberalism, right? Liberalism evolves from classic into modern liberalism, but then, as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, some people look at modern liberalism, they look at Keynes and say, that is too much collectivism. We're violating the soul of America. We're destroying the independence that America is built on, and we're destroying self-interest, and we're creating a culture of dependence, and we're on the road to serfdom as we'll be dependent upon government. And therefore we have this counter-revolution, if you will, this shift back towards classic liberalism that I called neoclassic liberalism. Also in this chapter, it tries to talk about that idea of can you be free if your needs are not met? So is it better to be free but living in scarcity and living in hunger because the government's not there to provide for you? Or is it better to have your needs met but not be free? So that's this trade-off between freedom and control that is one of the recurring themes of the course. Second half of this chapter introduces a number of challenges to contemporary liberalism, and one that I talk about often is environmentalism. That I would argue this could be the antithesis of capitalism. That from Social 10, the ecological footprint, the impact on the biosphere, the lack of sustainability, this paradigm, it may not be viable, and if the core of the paradigm is capitalism, then capitalism is not viable because of the ecological cost of it. So one of the challenges to liberalism is the environmental cost of liberalism. Capitalism is challenged by the footprint, the ecological footprint that it's leaving on the planet. Capitalism is challenged as we're running out of oil. Capitalism is challenged as we're changing the climate. You could have a capitalist endeavor. You're a fisherman, but you're challenged if you end up depleting the fish stocks and there's no fish left. Your business will go out of business when you have used up all those resources. The textbook introduces the idea of carbon tax that since the textbook was introduced has become not just something that's being proposed but something that's being practiced in Canada. So how should the government respond to the environmental cost of our economics? Should they tax our economic activities with something like a carbon tax and use that money to try to reinvest in purifying the environment? So we generate billions of dollars and plant some more trees, generate billions of dollars and protect the fragile habitats of endangered animals. The textbook then goes into more detail as it flops around into neocons and neocon policy with neoconservatives and neoliberals. Again, I'm not really distinguishing the two groups much for you because who we're really talking about here fit into both groups, and who we're talking about are Milton Friedman from a theoretical side. Friedman is the economist. He is like John Maynard Keynes in the sense that he's the thinker. And then who does he inspire? Keynes inspired FDR. Friedman will inspire in the UK Margaret Thatcher, and here in America he inspires President Reagan, and in Canada he inspires Prime Minister Mulroney. So within this neocon idea is that, patriotism's good. Let's swear allegiance to the flag, and that capitalism's preferred, and we should promote capitalism internationally, even by using our military. And morals need to be defended, right? The traditional morals need to be defended, and there's a core connection to the cornerstone that is religion. And religion was and had been adrift in society. What is the purpose of the church within the state? And neocons were uncomfortable with how much connection to the church people had lost. Political influence of the Christian right became more important here. So, for example, modern liberals generally agree women have the right to choose to have an abortion. And Christian right may say, we support the rights of the unborn child. Modern liberals might favor equal rights for all people to marry and all people to identify as different genders and sexual orientations. The neocons and Christian right are more comfortable looking at traditional heterosexual families. Modern liberals support freedom to create and distribute any material that does not infringe upon the rights of others. So kind of like a John Stuart Mill, a harm principle thing. So let's distribute any material that doesn't hurt someone else. The Christian right and neocons might say, well, no, some things do need to be regulated. Music needs to be regulated, censored. There's lyrics there that are offensive. Television, movies, we don't want to have violent and sexual acts being shown. And there's products like heroin, or there's products, well, not guns. We love our guns, but there's products like heroin that may have a social cost, right, to more than just the user. Modern liberals support secular, non-faith-based policies, whereas Christian right and the neocons do once again see that religion has a place in publicly funded schools and institutions. So, in summary, neocons and neolibs, they value individualism, right? They value this idea of we need to be responsible for our own actions, self-interest. Whereas modern liberals, as they drift towards collectivism, they embrace concepts like collective responsibility and the common good. The textbook, Chapter 8, kind of finishes up with some insight into Aboriginal collective thought and Aboriginal justice. And with regards to Aboriginal collective thought, in Canada, again, we have about 600 tribes in Canada. So whenever you talk about all of Canada's First Nations and Indigenous peoples as one entity, you are overgeneralizing. But the textbook does just that. They overgeneralize. And some of the connections, some of the values, beliefs, morals that they connect with Canada's First Peoples are things like egalitarianism, the idea that everyone will be equal. Things like a relationship to the land that is that we are the stewards of the earth. A connection to the path through oral or spoken history. And the idea that because we are a community, if there has been something wrong within the community, we all need to be a part of the justice. And that is how in grade 9 you learned about the sentencing circles. That's a part of Aboriginal justice. And that, my friends, is Chapter 8. So again, the main thing at the end of chapter 8 is we want you to understand that liberalism continues to evolve. It went from classic to modern liberalism, freedom from to freedom through government, but that's not the end of the story. Some people are like, maybe we need to go back a little bit. And those are neocons, neolibs that are saying we need more freedom from government again. And then we have in this chapter the idea that there's other things that may force liberalism to evolve, other challenges to liberalism, things like environmentalism. And then the chapter ends with the idea that, you know what, we have other perspectives in the world. That if if liberalism is based upon tolerance and plurality, multiplicity, the idea that there can be multiple ideas and viewpoints, then one of the groups that here in Canada we may want to listen to more are Canada's Indigenous people, Canada's First Nations, the Aboriginal Canadians. All right, and that is, my friends, a quick look at chapter 8.